Welcome back to Catholic Lunch Break here on AM 1430. This is the weekly program where we catch up with all things Catholic in the greater Houston area. My name is Wyatt Goolsby. I'm the executive director of this radio station, KSHJ. And on this program, we love to highlight what is good, beautiful, and true. Often that involves Catholic literature, as well as literature inspired by the Catholic faith. One organization here in town that does so is called Catholic Literary Arts, and they have a big event coming up on Saturday, February the 8th. They're having their big dinner party, appropriately called the dinner party. The keynote speaker for this upcoming event is Mark Brumley. He is the president of Ignatius Press. And we are honored here on the program to welcome in Mark Brumley. He's willing to contact us via the power of the internet. He is based in California. A Catholic convert himself, Mark's career in Catholic communications spans nearly 3 decades with organizations like Catholic Answers, the Diocese of San Diego, and of course, Ignatius Press. Mark, thanks so much for taking the time to be here on the program with us.
I am happy to be with you.
I want to ask you all about your background and why you came to the Catholic faith, but first, let's start with Ignatius Press. For people who are unfamiliar, tell me a little about the company, about the organization. Maybe people have seen the word Ignatius Press on the sides of books in Catholic bookstores.
Yeah, Ignatius Press was founded, I guess it would be 5 decades ago, almost 5 decades ago, by Father Joseph Fessio, a Jesuit, who is still our editor. And he is really a quite remarkable man. He was a student of Joseph Ratzinger, later Benedict XVI. His mentor was one of the great theologians of the 20th century, Henri de Lubac. He studied the writings of Hans Urs von Balthasar and really started Ignatius Press at a time in Catholic publishing when things were sort of in decline. Coming out of the Second Vatican Council, there was a lot of confusion, a lot of new things going on, but a lot of old things in decline. And one of the new things that was going on was the founding of Ignatius Press. And so we, over the years, have published the works of people like Ratzinger and de Lubac and Hans Urs von Balthasar, but also more popular things, books by people like Carl Keating, for example, or Michael O'Brien, the novelist, and any number of other writers.
It's amazing how books can communicate with people across cultures, across time. What do you think it is, Mark, that about the written word, maybe spoken word after people read and write it, that makes books and literature so special?
Well, from my perspective, books are powerful because they they inspire and enlighten the imagination. Our great stories are captured and passed along by books. Before books, obviously, there was an oral culture, but you can't quite have the same experience in an oral culture as in written culture. Written culture allows a kind of wider, at least when you have the printing press, a wider distribution of the text. So the ability to capture these images of our minds, to have our imaginations formed, and then our minds informed, power of inspiration. I think of all of the great books that have motivated me over the years and allowed me to have a much richer and fuller life. I think that's really the power of the printed word. And I think that's something that's very hard to replace. I'm not an opponent of ebooks. I read ebooks. We publish a number of our books in ebook format, but I think there's something special about the physicality of the printed word. You can go back to it. You can find it easily. You can even do things like mark it up, which is what I often do in my books. I know that's blasphemy to some people, but I mark up my books as a way of sort of making them my own and deepening my ability to benefit from the words of the author.
Yeah, it is amazing. And I hear that as well, Mark, that a lot of people like physical books, being able to buy the book and then being able to open it. Like I said, in some cases, write in the margins or write their own notes. Like I said, there is something special about being able to physically touch and being able to physically write with a writing utensil. I want to acknowledge again the fact that you're going to be the keynote speaker at an upcoming event called the Dinner Party, which is going to be Saturday, February 8th. It's a benefit fundraiser for Catholic literary arts. I know you don't want to give away too much about what you're going to say in your speech, but you're coming to Houston. You're going to be speaking at the Cathedral of Our Lady of Walsingham in the parish hall there, which is named in honor of Benedict XVI. But what can you tease for us about what you're going to say about the publishing world and that kind of situation right now?
Well, I want to tell people it's an exciting time. It's a transformative time in Catholic publishing. We're on the cusp, I think, of a new Catholic literary revival. There was a Catholic literary revival in the 30s and 40s and into the 50s in the United States, especially, but more broadly in the English-speaking world, and to some extent, I shouldn't say limit to the English-speaking world, include the French-speaking world. I think we're on the cusp of something like that, but bigger. It's going to be transformative of the mission of the Church in the United States and interaction with the wider culture. I'll leave you a little expression here. Father Fessio, again, he's the founder and editor of Ignatius Press. He's not much of a movie buff. I watch a lot of movies as well as read a lot of books. He reads books, but he doesn't really watch movies. We were talking about the difference between these two things. And he had this expression, the phrase, a picture's worth 1,000 words. He had this expression, a word is worth 1,000 pictures. And I think we're going to see the power of that expression. I'll talk about that when I'm visiting you folks in Houston next month. The power of the word to generate 1,000 pictures, 1,000 images, inspire 1,000 imaginations, and by that inspiration, work to transform our world. I think that's what's ahead for us, Lord willing, certainly in the Catholic publishing world, the Catholic publishing scene that's emerging right now.
Speaking of transformation, I do want to ask you about your own journey personally, Mark, and that is reading about your conversion to the Catholic faith. Do you mind telling me a little bit about your background and what it was about the Catholic Church that attracted you to it?
Sure. I tell my story. I started out as a nun, and then I had a conversion. When I say nun, I don't mean an N-U-N. This day and age, I hasten to qualify that statement.
Right.
I was an N-O-N-E.
Yeah.
That's right. As a none of the above, I was a South St. Louis unaffiliated theist. I came from a good family background, but we didn't have commitment to any particular church or religious perspective. And I had an evangelical Christian experience. Was initially very anti-Catholic, but I gradually worked through that and became more Catholic friendly, and eventually came to see that the New Testament church was really the Catholic Church. One of the big themes in evangelical Protestantism is to be true to New Testament Christianity, as opposed to all of these things that supposedly corrupted the original biblical message, But over a long period of time, detail we're not probably in the position to go into here. I came to the conviction that biblical Christianity, New Testament Christianity, was Catholic Christianity. I was very motivated by evangelical zeal and apologetics. So I did a lot of apologetics defending the Christian faith. Became clear to me that many of the sources, the early Christian sources that I went to defend the pedigree of the New Testament. You're going to make the argument for Jesus, you have to make the argument that the New Testament record of Jesus is reasonably historically accurate. But to do that, you have to somewhat, at least, trace the pedigree of those documents to show that in the generation immediately after the apostolic time, these were people that sourced, knew who wrote these works and so on. Well, those were, as it turns out, much to my chagrin, those were Catholic bishops. And so this was part of a long journey on a sort of kind of rigidly theological, intellectual level. That was the trajectory. But I have to mention, in connection with fiction and novels and things of that sort, I was very influenced by C.S. Lewis, who himself not a Catholic. He was an Anglican. He helped move me beyond a kind of narrow sort of evangelicalism to a kind of a broader vision of what he called mere Christianity. I was also, by the way, influenced by a fellow named Frank Sheed, who wrote a book called Theology and Sanity, which I'm happy to report. It's a classic. It was written originally in the 1940s, that Ignatius Press publishes and continues to keep in print. It's a very powerful book. But anyway, my point with respect to Lewis is he began to fuel not just my intellect, but my imagination, and gave me a kind of I would say, a Catholic imagination, even though he never came into full communion with the Catholic Church. And that Catholic imagination, that way of seeing what he called mere Christianity, really was a stand-in for the Catholic Church, the Catholic faith. And by reading Lewis's fiction as well as his nonfiction apologetics and other things, I want to say I captured the Catholic imaginative vision, but in point of fact, I was captured by it. So that's a kind of a longer version of the short version of how I came into the Catholic Church.
I love that story because I hear about that from other Catholic converts, Mark, people who have studied the history of the Catholic Church. They've read from Catholic bishops, and they've had a conversion to Catholicism intellectually, historically, spiritually. It's all encompassing. And so I really see that in your story as a true conversion in that sense, not one that was simply hurried into or felt pressured into, but one that you really carefully considered. And to that end, I know that a lot of that literature, the books that influenced you, I know you try to recommend to other people as well. Why do you think it's so important for young people at a very young age to be reading some of these materials, to start learning some of these theological principles so early in life?
Well, I think it's crucial because God gave us minds and God gave us hearts. And literature appeals to the mind and to the heart. It's not just enough that we have the power of logic and logical thinking. It's not just enough that we have the power of imagination, but we really need the combination of the two for a full experience of reality. And of course, God is ultimate reality. He's the ground of all the things that we experience in this world. He is the good and the true and the beautiful. And in that sense, he's sort of the intersection of the desires of the heart and the will and the imagination of the mind and the power of reasoning of the intellect. All these things come together in God. And you, by forming young people early on, you help them develop their sensors, as it were, for the true and the good and the beautiful. I think it's very important. I will say this one other thing about my own conversion. One of the things that attracted me to Catholicism was that it was all-encompassing. It sought to provide insights to the whole of reality. There was not the idea that, well, you just read the Bible or you just approached literature as a purely sort of propagandistic tool to convert. It was this sense that the whole of human experience is a sort of sacrament for God, an encounter with God, who is its origin, its sustainer, and its fulfillment. And so the idea that Tolkien later, I'll tell you later if we get a chance why I was suspicious of Tolkien originally, but Tolkien, this idea of subcreation, that writers are used by God, or they tap into God's creativity to create subcreations. This whole idea is very powerful for young people today, especially people in the creative arts, the visual arts and the literary arts. The idea of subcreation, the idea of almost like a muse, is something that's very powerful and attractive. And Catholicism makes sense of that. So introducing people early on to the Catholic intellectual and imaginative tradition of great literature and great stories is very powerful and helps fulfill people when they grow up. They come to see the world as an enchanted place, a divinely enchanted place.
If you're just now joining us, you're listening to AM 1430. This is Catholic Lunch Break, the weekly program where we catch up with all things Catholic in the greater Houston area. Getting ready for a visit from Mark Brumley here to Houston. He's the president of Ignatius Press. He's going to be in town on Saturday, February the 8th, as the keynote speaker at the Dinner Party, which is a fundraiser for Catholic Literary Arts, which is an organization based here in Houston. Mark, I want to go back and sure, we could talk all about Tolkien and C.S. Lewis because those are absolutely fascinating. But I do want to go back and ask you a little bit more about whether your career has been really rewarding and being able to promote the Catholic faith. Because I had mentioned the fact that you've worked for Catholic Answers, you've worked for the Diocese of San Diego, and now Ignatius Press. Has going down this path of Catholicism and being able to talk and explain the faith and talk about the faith been rewarding to you personally?
Oh, absolutely. Well, it's part of my sanctification. I mean,
Hmm.
we are, God gives us, there's a universal call to holiness. So it's a vocation to holiness for everybody.
Hmm.
And then he gives us particular vocations, and mine was to marriage and family life. But even within that, there are various callings that God has for us. And for me, the ability to read and write and speak and listen and sharing the Catholic faith with others through apologetics at Catholic Answers and my work in terms of social outreach and social justice and social ministries with the diocese. And these many years now, 30 years with Ignatius Press and publishing has just been a great blessing. And for me, a way to grow closer to the Lord and feel like I'm doing what he's asked me to do.
Very good. As I mentioned, you're going to be coming to Houston, and the dinner party is going to be hosted on the campus of the Cathedral of Our Lady of Walsingham. Of course, Mark, you've been there before. I've seen you
Yes.
there over the last several years. We've been honored to have author Joseph Pierce in
That's right.
town, and you've been there with him as well. What do you think it is about the community of the Cathedral of Our Lady of Walsingham that makes it so special? Because I do find it to be a very lovely community that definitely wants to promote Catholic faith and Catholic values.
Well, I think certainly the ordinariate there, bringing elements from the Anglican tradition, that's very helpful because in some ways the Anglican tradition has elements of English Catholicism that should have been, and there's an understanding that God, worked in the Anglican tradition, even though it wasn't in full communion
Mhm.
with the Catholic Church. It was nevertheless running on sort of Catholic energies in many respects, and so it's great that that tradition that emerged uh, gets reincorporated back into full communion with the Catholic Church, and you see that in the people there. They're very interested in uh, certainly the gospel, obviously advancing the gospel, but in a very well-rounded, cultured way, not in the sort of, I don't mean cultured in a kind of elitist way, but taking seriously God's gift of culture to us because we transmit the faith, we share the faith by culture. Culture is a way of life. And so to be part of a community of Catholics that appreciate that, that cultivate it, that help people grow in holiness through the use of their minds and their creative powers is such a wonderful thing. And I think that's what you see operative there.
I want to go back and ask you. I'd be remiss if I don't, Mark, ask you go back about C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, because I find when I'm around Catholic circles, whether they're intellectuals at the Cathedral of Our Lady of Walsingham or other folks, I do find that people really feel a certain attraction to the literature of Lewis and Tolkien. What do you think it is in Catholic circles that people just seem drawn to these two authors and their works?
I think it's sacramentality. Well, if we're talking about the fictional dimension of Lewis, I
Mhm.
think that it's sacramentality that the divine is encountered in certain ways, the ordinariness of the world and the struggle between good and evil that we find in the world.
Mhm.
That it's sort of, in Lewis's case, it's a door into a wider universe. And thinking here of the wardrobe from Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe and the Chronicles of Narnia. In Tolkien's case, the creation of a whole history of England, but indirectly history of the world that retells the biblical themes and using non-biblical language. It catches you off guard and sort of baptizes your imagination before you realize it, and you're being brought into what is essentially a Catholic world. So I think it's just tremendously attractive. I was suspicious of Tolkien
Mhm.
at first because I was an evangelical Christian and he was a papist. But more to the point, this was back in the 70s, and a lot of the people that liked The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings were the druggies, the drug culture hippies. So I was suspicious at first, but then I
Very, very
realized
different nowadays, right?
exactly very different. I realized that well, if he was a friend of Lewis's, you must be okay. And so then when I read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, it was just transformative. It's like how in the world could I ever think this was something nefarious?
Yeah. Once you actually dig into the actual writings themselves, it's
Yeah, the
fantastic.
deepness of it. I mean, you're just captivated. You're just taken in. People talk about fantasy fiction being escapist, and it can be in some instances, but really good fantasy fiction isn't escapist. It confronts you with reality on an even deeper level. The circumstances, the situations, some of the characters may seem fantastical, but the issues that they deal with, the experiences and emotions that they create, are all part of deep, deep reality. And that's what I would say about Lord of the Rings.
And it continues to attract young people to this day. Very good. Well, we are looking forward to hearing more from you coming up on Saturday, February the 8th, when you are in Houston talking about the publishing world for writers and readers of faith and some of the good news and why we should feel optimistic about that. Again, if you want to hear from Mark Brumley, you can learn more about going to Catholic Literary Arts website and signing up to go and to the dinner party, which is a fundraiser for that organization. Again, it's going to be happening Saturday, February the 8th at Cathedral High School, which is on the campus of Our Lady of Walsingham. Mark Brumley, the president of Ignatius Press, thank you so much for your time and talking with us today and delving a little bit deeper into literature.
Thank you for all the great things you do.